A father killed his son for his own gain, but will he regret his actions? Subscribe if you like the story. Let's get started. October 31st, 1978. Arbor Creek, Texas. Arbor Creek was the kind of town that never truly shed its autumn chill. Even on sunny days, the shadows here seemed heavier, older, and far darker than anywhere else in Texas. This was especially true on Halloween. This evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon and the twilight turned the color of old blood, the air grew thick and saturated with the smell of dampness, burnt sugar, and something vaguely bitter that always hung over the Crawford property. Silas Crawford, an 8-year-old boy with hair the color of dry grass and eyes that held too much worry for his age, stood on the porch, clutching a bucket decorated with a faded ghost. He wore a pirate costume, a black vest, an eye patch, all the trimmings, but he did not look happy in the slightest. "Dad, I don't want to go," he whispered softly, his voice echoing strangely in the dead silence that had settled over the neighborhood. Arthur Crawford, his father, replied in a voice as sharp as a dry twig snapping, without even looking at his son. Arthur was tall, with a heavy face and a constantly strained jawline. His elegant, though worn, three-piece suit clashed with the festive rush, giving the impression that he had come straight from financial hell. "Don't be ridiculous, Silas," Arthur said, adjusting his tie. "It's Halloween. Your sister is waiting. And remember, the more we collect, the sooner we can start a new life." The words about a new life Arthur had been repeating for the past 6 months, and to Silas, they sounded less like a promise and more like a cold, terrifying prayer. Lori, Silas's older sister, emerged from the doorway. She was 12 and dressed as a Native American. Lori was the only one who maintained a semblance of normalcy in this house. She was cautious but not timid, and she quickly noticed how much her younger brother was trembling. "Are you okay, Silas?" she asked. "The shadows, they are watching," he whispered, not taking his eyes off the dense, unnaturally black shadow that filled the corner of the porch where no light reached. Arthur waved his hand dismissively. "It's just time for your bedtime. Let's go. We don't have much time to hit the best houses." They descended the porch steps. The wind rustled the dead leaves, and they scraped against the asphalt like hundreds of small, invisible claws. Even the street lights seemed insufficient. A tension hung in the air, a foreboding. Arthur Crawford had a perfect reason for this walk, and that reason was worth exactly $60,000. Furthermore, his debts to creditors were close to $100,000, and the loan shark, nicknamed the Eel, had given him a final deadline, tomorrow morning. At this moment, Arthur felt no love for his children or family duty, only icy, relentless pressure. He knew that this Halloween would be his last chance. They walked down the street, where other children in bright costumes were already chattering. But as they passed under the old, crooked oak trees, Silas stopped. "Who is that there?" He pointed to the gap between two old trunks, where there was only an impenetrable black thicket. Arthur and Lori looked. Nothing, just the dense woods. "No one," Arthur said irritably. "It's just the trees." "No, it's there," Silas quietly insisted. "It's waiting. It knows we are coming." Arthur quickly pulled him along, feeling his composure begin to crack. He couldn't allow this boy to ruin everything with his fantasies. Meanwhile, as they walked deeper into the dark street where the houses stood far apart, Arthur clutched a small plastic bag in his coat pocket containing 4 thin paper tubes. They were Pixie Stix candies, but these were special. They had no logo. The paper was old, a dull yellow, and on the end of each tube was a barely visible but strange, carved symbol resembling 3 curved claws. Arthur hadn't bought them at a store. He had received them this morning. He had received them from him. Arthur Crawford was not merely an embezzler or a man down on his luck. He was a desperate gambler who had long believed that the universe owed him wealth. His current financial abyss wasn't due to poor investment. It was due to a series of disastrous, high-risk ventures and an addiction to a kind of opulent lifestyle he could no longer afford. The looming debt from the Eel was the least of his worries. The real threat lay in the quiet, binding nature of his most recent and most secret arrangement. That morning, November 1st, had been the day of the final reckoning. Arthur was sitting alone in his desolate study, a room too large and too grand for the empty promises it now housed, nursing a whiskey that did little to calm his shaking hands. The clock ticked towards 9 a.m., the hour his life was slated to implode. Then came the knock. It wasn't the sharp, aggressive rap of a collector. It was a soft, almost hesitant tap, tap, tap. Arthur opened the door to find no one. He was about to slam it shut when his eyes dropped to the welcome mat. Lying there was a small, tightly folded, parchment-like envelope. It felt dry and brittle like old skin. Inside, there was no note, no threat, and no solution. There was only a single piece of heavy vellum upon which three things were meticulously drawn. 1. A diagram of the home's insurance policy, specifically highlighting Silas's name and the $60,000 payout figure. Arthur hadn't reviewed the policy in years. He didn't even remember increasing Silas's coverage. 2. A crude, almost childish drawing of the pixie sticks candies with the inscription, "The sweetest prize for the darkest night." 3. The symbol, the 3 curved claws, exactly like the one etched on the candies he now possessed. As Arthur stared at the vellum, the desperation in his chest dissolved, replaced by a cold, surgical clarity. It wasn't just a suggestion. It felt like a command that had been there all along, waiting for him to notice. The $60,000 wasn't just enough to cover the debt. It was enough to start over, exactly as he'd promised his children. But who was the one who sent the vellum? He remembered a fleeting conversation a few weeks prior, not with the eel, but with an intermediary, a man who spoke less and listened more, a shadow in a back alley bar who offered him a chance to resolve all burdens. The intermediary spoke in riddles about paying the old debt of Arbor Creek. Later that same day, the pixie sticks appeared. They were not delivered by hand. Arthur found them tucked beneath his pillow when he returned from a humiliating meeting with a bank manager. When he touched the paper, the cold sensation wasn't just from the packaging. It was a profound, internal chill that settled deep in his core. He hadn't questioned where they came from or how they appeared. His mind, driven solely by survival and greed, had accepted them as the only viable escape route. Now, as he walked the streets of Arbor Creek, forcing his son to participate in the charade, the packet of poison tubes felt hot and accusatory in his pocket. They stopped at a large, brightly lit house, the kind that gives out full-size chocolate bars. Arthur made sure the children approached the door alone while he stood back, pretending to check his watch. When they returned, Silas's bucket was slightly heavier, but the boy's anxiety was palpable. "Dad, I saw it again," Silas whispered, his small face pale beneath the pirate eye patch. Near the porch light, it looked like a broken tree branch that moved on its own. Lori, pragmatic as ever, tried to reassure him. "It's just the wind, Silas. It's a creepy night." "No, it smelled like the basement," Silas insisted, looking directly at his father. "It smells like where you hide things." Arthur froze. The house had a deep, damp, and notoriously dark stone basement. Arthur had indeed been down there recently, not to hide anything, but to look at something he had tried to ignore for years. A strange, centuries-old etching on one of the foundation stones, a symbol that looked startlingly similar to the 3 curved claws. The mention of the basement symbol, a detail he'd never shared, shattered his composure. "That's enough, Silas," Arthur snapped, his voice barely controlled. "It's time to hurry up. We have a few more houses to visit, then we are done." His plan was simple. The children would collect candy. At a specific, dark intersection, Arthur would subtly place the poisoned pixie sticks into their bags, pretending he received them from an unseen, overly generous neighbor. He would then ensure Silas consumed his dose immediately while making sure Lori and the other recipients, a contingency to deflect suspicion, did not. But standing here, under the pale glow of a flickering street lamp, Arthur realized his plan was flawed, not logistically, but morally. He had convinced himself that this was necessary, a tragic accident to save the family. But now, looking at the unnatural terror in his son's eyes, he wondered if he was merely executing the will of something ancient and terrible that had been watching the Crawfords for a very long time. He had made a vow, and the price was about to be paid. Arthur pushed the children onward, maintaining a brisk pace that was clearly meant to rush the process. They were now moving into the older section of Arbor Creek, where the houses were larger, surrounded by unkempt hedges, and spaced far enough apart to create vast pockets of silence and shadow between the porch lights. Lori, sensing her father's severe tension, kept quiet, focused on her burgeoning candy haul. Silas, however, was becoming increasingly agitated. His fear was no longer the generic dread of a child on a scary night. It was focused, visceral, and directed at the very environment they were traversing. "It's getting closer, Dad," Silas whispered, tugging on Arthur's sleeve. "The air is sticky, like cobwebs, but thicker." Arthur ignored him, his mind running logistics. He needed to plant the evidence soon. They approached the corner of Willow and Blackwood, a notoriously dark intersection because the city had never bothered to replace the broken street lamp there. "Lori, you and Silas go to the big house with the pumpkin on the roof," Arthur instructed, pointing to a distant colonial house. "I'll wait here. I need to check my work schedule." It was a flimsy excuse, but the children, distracted by the promise of more treats, didn't question it. As the children disappeared into the gloom, their pirate and Native American costumes blending with the shadows, Arthur's hands worked quickly. He pulled out the 4 specially marked pixie sticks. He placed one in Lori's nearly full bucket, 2 into the bags of passing children he barely glanced at, and the 4th, the one he had mentally designated for Silas, he placed carefully near the top of Silas's pirate bucket. He watched the children approach the next house. He needed the transaction to look organic. When they returned, their buckets would be full, and the poison candies would be mixed in, ready for discovery later, except for Silas's. Arthur had practiced his next move in his mind 100 times. Offer the children a bonus treat from a fictitious, overly generous neighbor he'd met just around the corner. Lori and Silas reappeared, their excitement briefly overcoming Silas's earlier dread. "Look how much Mrs. Albright gave us," Lori exclaimed, holding up a heavy bag. "Fantastic," Arthur said, forcing a smile that felt like tearing paper. He reached into his coat and produced the 4 identical, but harmless, pixie sticks he had bought from the drugstore earlier that day. Hold on," Arthur said theatrically, pulling the kids to a stop near the black shadow of the broken street lamp. "A man up the block, in a cloak, pretty spooky, gave me a handful of these special old-fashioned ones. Let's split them. One for you, Lori, and one for you, Silas." He handed them the safe candies. Lori immediately tore hers open, pouring the sugary powder on her tongue. Silas, however, stared at the treat in his hand, then looked at his father's face, a long, searching gaze that unnerved Arthur profoundly. "This isn't the same," Silas stated flatly, his voice devoid of childish wonder. "The one you put in my bucket, that was the one with the claw mark." Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. How could he have seen that? The light was terrible, and the placement was quick. "Don't be silly, Silas. It's just a different brand," Arthur stammered, his mind racing. He had to pivot. He couldn't risk Silas examining the lethal treat later. "Eat it now, Silas," Arthur urged, trying to sound encouraging, though the demand was clear. "It's a special treat from Dad. Let's try it together." Lori was already licking the sugar from her lips. "They're great, Silas. Try it." Silas slowly peeled the paper from the safe pixie sticks. He took a hesitant lick, his eyes still fixed on the shadow pool where the street lamp was out. "It doesn't smell like the basement," Silas mused, taking a larger sip of the sugar. "Of course not." Arthur breathed out a sigh of relief. It was in that precise moment of relief that the true horror began. The shadows beneath the broken street lamp coalesced. They did not shift or sway. They tightened, thickening into a shape that was taller than a man, impossibly slender, and completely devoid of light. Silas dropped his candy. He wasn't looking at the entity itself, but through it, at his father. "The other one," Silas whispered, his voice cracking with pure terror. "The one in the bucket. They want me to eat the one with the claw mark." Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. He glanced at the bucket, where the lethal candy lay waiting, and then back at the impossible, silent shape. It was as if the entity had used the child's own fear to make its final, lethal demand. The safe treat had been a distraction. The deadly one was the true vow. Before Arthur could move or speak, before he could even try to retrieve the poisoned item, Silas, driven by a horrifying, perhaps preternatural compulsion, reached into his bucket. His small fingers wrapped around the paper tube, marked with the 3 curved claws. He tore it open and poured the entire contents onto his tongue. The scream that followed was not one of pain, but of profound, agonizing violation, a sound that seemed to draw the very shadows closer. Silas collapsed onto the cold asphalt, convulsing, his eyes wide and fixed on his father. In that last moment, before the life left his eyes, Silas didn't see Arthur the father or Arthur the murderer. He saw the shimmering, skeletal figure that stood behind Arthur, its mouth, or where a mouth should be, curved into a silent, triumphant grimace. And the boy spoke, not in English, but in a guttural, ancient sound that chilled Arthur to the bone. Samhain. The aftermath of Silas's death was a chaos of flashing blue and red lights, the wail of sirens, and the stunned, horrified faces of parents who had rushed to the intersection of Willow and Blackwood. Arthur, in a performance honed by months of desperation, was a masterpiece of contrived anguish. He screamed, he wept, and he cradled his dead son's small body until the paramedics gently pulled him away. Lori, who had witnessed the terrifying speed of her brother's collapse, was frozen in shock, clutching her candy bucket and murmuring incoherently about the shadow that smelled like the basement. It was a nightmare perfectly executed, Arthur thought, despite the hideous intervention of the thing near the lamppost. The key elements were in place. It was Halloween, and the poison was in a widely distributed candy. His alibi, that a stranger must have handed out the tainted sweets, was tragically plausible. The case immediately drew the attention of Detective Elias Wayne of the Arbor Creek PD. Wayne was a man in his late 40s, his face etched with permanent skepticism and the scars of a recently failed marriage. He preferred logic and paperwork to the emotional theatrics of street crime. He arrived at the scene and immediately noted the silence of the other children and the almost inhuman intensity of Arthur Crawford's grief. Cyanide, a paramedic stated, pulling Detective Wayne aside. Fastest case I've ever seen. Whatever he ingested was a massive dose. Wayne nodded, looking at the untouched candy in Silas's bucket. He noted the few surviving pixie sticks and the small, old-looking one marked with a strange, claw-like etching. He picked it up gingerly with a gloved hand and placed it in an evidence bag. The police quickly recovered the other 2 bags Arthur had salted with poison treats, one belonging to a boy named Billy Jenkins and the other to a girl named Patty Evans. Thankfully, neither child had consumed the candy. The news spread like wildfire. A madman was poisoning local children's treats on Halloween. Panic seized Arbor Creek. The following day, Wayne interviewed Arthur and Lori in their sterile, quiet living room. "Mr. Crawford," Wayne began, leaning forward, "can you describe the man who handed out these special candies?" Arthur, playing the role of the distraught father flawlessly, described a vague figure, tall, wearing a dark raincoat, standing in the shadows, a perfect generic bogeyman. He said they were old-fashioned treats. "I didn't think twice," Arthur lied, his eyes tearing up on cue. "He was gone before I could thank him properly." Lori, sitting next to him, was pale but composed. When Wayne turned to her, her answers were unsettlingly specific. "He didn't give us the bad ones," Lori said softly, looking at her hands. "Dad did. He put them in our buckets when he was checking his schedule." Arthur's face went white, but before he could intervene, Lori continued. "But the really bad one, the one Silas ate, the one with the claw mark." She paused, trembling. "That one was special. When Silas ate it, I didn't see the man in the raincoat. I saw the shadow. It was behind Daddy. It was smiling." Arthur immediately jumped in. "Lori, honey, you're confusing the shadows with your fear. You had a terrible shock. The police know we're looking for a man." Wayne held up a hand, silencing Arthur. He recognized the classic maneuver of a parent coaching a witness, But Laurie's description of the shadow and the claw mark was oddly compelling. It was too specific for a random lie, and too bizarre for a simple truth. "Laurie, do you remember if your father went to the Albright house with you?" Wayne asked, changing the subject, testing Arthur's timeline. "No," Laurie said instantly. He waited at the dark corner. This was the first logical crack in Arthur's story. Wayne had checked the neighbors. No one recalled seeing a man in a raincoat handing out treats near the dark intersection. The only adults there were the parents accompanying their children, including Arthur. Wayne looked at Arthur, who was now sweating profusely despite the cool room. "Mr. Crawford," Wayne said, his tone hardening. "We've checked the path. No neighbor recalls handing out pixie sticks. And the poison tubes were only found in the bags of children you personally escorted and 2 others you came into contact with. Furthermore, your daughter states you placed them in the buckets yourself." The performance was over. Arthur's eyes betrayed a flicker of pure panic. "This is ridiculous," Arthur spat, rising to his feet. "Are you accusing me? I love my son. Some lunatic poisoned these kids. I was just trying to divert attention from my own family." Wayne didn't raise his voice, but the weight of his next words filled the room. "We ran the financials, Mr. Crawford. Your massive debts, your desperate situation, and the fact that you recently increased Silas's life insurance policy to $60,000. Not just a suspect, sir. You're the only person with motive, means, and opportunity." Arthur was cornered. He fell back onto the sofa, his facade crumbling into miserable, greedy desperation. "It was the only way," he muttered, dropping his head into his hands. "The only way to save everything." As Wayne formally placed him under arrest, leading him out of the house and past the morbidly curious crowd that had gathered, the detective still had a knot in his stomach. The financial motive was solid, the evidence was damning, and the case was closed. But as Wayne drove away from the Crawford house, he looked into his rearview mirror. He could have sworn he saw a momentary flicker, a dense, undulating shadow at the upper attic window of a house that had been completely dark. He shook his head. Just exhaustion. Just a shadow. The case was solved. Or so he thought. He still had that strange pixie sticks with the 3 curved claws in his evidence lockup. And he still needed to find out what that symbol meant, and why Laurie had said the shadow behind her father was smiling. Arthur Crawford was behind bars, his desperate gamble having failed spectacularly, leaving him with nothing but the $60,000 worth of guilt and the cold stone of a jail cell. For Detective Elias Wayne, the case should have been closed. The motive was clear, the confession, albeit partial, was secured, and the public fear was temporarily placated. Yet, the claw-marked candy wrapper gnawed at him. It was too antique, too specific, and too unsettlingly similar to the details Laurie had provided. Wayne was a pragmatic man, but he couldn't shake the image of the 8-year-old boy screaming the word Samhain. The day after the arrest, Wayne decided to pull a thread that had nothing to do with police procedure, the history of Arbor Creek. He drove to the town's oldest building, the local library, a structure of heavy gray stone that predated the town's official incorporation. He found Mrs. Eleanor Vance, the town's archivist and resident historian, dusting old vellum scrolls in the back room. Wayne presented the evidence bag containing the sinister paper tube with a claw-mark symbol. "Mrs. Vance, have you ever seen this symbol before?" Mrs. Vance put on her reading glasses, squinted at the bag, and a slow, deep frown creased her face. She didn't look surprised. She looked afraid. "This is not a modern design, detective," she murmured, her voice thin as parchment. "This is the 3 bins. It's been part of Arbor Creek lore for longer than this library has stood." She led Wayne through the stacks of mildewed books until they reached a dusty, bound volume labeled simply, "Local Accounts, 1820 to 1900. She opened it to a brittle, yellowed page. There, drawn in faded ink, was the identical symbol, the 3 bins. The old settlers, mostly Scottish and Irish stock, they came here with old debts, Mrs. Vance explained, tracing the symbol with a trembling finger. This symbol was attributed to what they called the Taker of Vows. It was said to represent a price, usually the most treasured possession, taken after a promise of wealth or safety. Wayne leaned in. Was it tied to any specific families? The Crawfords, detective, she said quietly. The Crawfords were one of the founding families. They owned all the land where your murder victim lived. The original patriarch, Silas Crawford, was a desperately poor man who suddenly amassed a huge fortune in the 1830s, right after a severe winter, and right after his youngest son mysteriously disappeared on Samhain night. Wayne felt a chill colder than the air in the library. Silas. The name echoed through the generations. Did the Taker of Vows take the child? The legend says he took the most valuable item the patriarch possessed at the time of the bargain, Mrs. Vance corrected. And on the night of Samhain, the old name for Halloween, the veil between the worlds is thin. The taker comes to collect. Wayne's police skepticism was fighting a losing battle against the mounting evidence of the uncanny. He was dealing not just with a killer, but with a pattern, a century-old echo of greed and tragedy. Arthur hadn't invented the pixie sticks plot. He had reenacted a ritual. Wayne returned to the precinct and immediately obtained a warrant to search the Crawford house's foundation. The basement that little Silas had mentioned, the place that smelled like where you hide things. The basement was exactly as Silas had described. Damp, dark, and heavy with the scent of wet earth and something metallic, like old coins or dried blood. Wayne shone his flashlight over the rough stone foundation. And there it was, etched into the largest foundation stone. Beneath the peeling whitewash was a symbol 10 times the size of the one on the candy wrapper. 3 bends. Beside it, scraped into the stone more recently, was a crude, desperate drawing, a map. It was a rough sketch of the house's exterior and the surrounding yard. At the very edge of the map, marked with a heavy X, was the broken street lamp at the intersection of Willow and Blackwood, the crossroads of dread. Wayne realized with terrifying clarity that Arthur had been trying to understand the symbol before the murder, perhaps even trying to locate the source of his promised wealth or his curse. But the most disturbing discovery was not the symbol itself, but a small, carefully sealed glass jar hidden beneath a loose floorboard near the etching. Wayne opened it. Inside were not gold coins, but a handful of dried, black earth. Embedded in the earth were 3 objects: a tarnished gold locket, a shriveled piece of what looked like human hair, and a small, brittle strip of old parchment. Wayne carefully unrolled the parchment. The ink had run badly over the decades, but he could make out 2 phrases written in an archaic, spidery script. 1. The vow shall pass to the next generation of blood until the price is paid in full. 2. The prize is only granted when the sun opens the mouth of the earth. Wayne frowned at the second phrase. Opens the mouth of the earth? What did that mean? He looked back at the basement stone, at the giant, menacing claw mark. Arthur Crawford had killed his son for $60,000, but he was merely following the script laid out by an ancient, malevolent force. The insurance policy was just the modern manifestation of the Taker of Vows prize. Suddenly, a realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. The man in the raincoat, the strange intermediary that Arthur claimed to have met. What if that meeting hadn't been in the back alley bar, but in the basement? What if Arthur had found the jar, read the script, and in his greed, had unwittingly activated the ancient vow? Wayne left the basement, the damp, bitter smell clinging to his uniform. Arthur Crawford was the murderer, convicted by logic and evidence. But the Taker of Vows was the true orchestrator, and it was still out there, waiting for the next Samhain. He knew he couldn't present this to the court, but he knew, with chilling certainty, that the story was far from over. 6 months had passed since Arthur Crawford's arrest. He was tried, convicted swiftly, and sentenced to death, a rare punishment for a crime so heinous, fueled by the sheer public horror that a father could murder his child for insurance money on Halloween night. The police department considered it the pinnacle of Detective Wayne's career. But for Elias Wayne, the case was a gaping wound. He kept the sealed evidence jar from the Crawford basement in a hidden lockbox at home, along with the brittle parchment and the claw-marked wrapper. He couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't convicted the true killer. They had merely apprehended a pawn. The Taker of Vows was still loose. Wayne had developed an obsession with the cryptic message, The prize is only granted when the sun opens the mouth of the earth. He knew it wasn't a metaphor. The vow, or curse, was rooted in the physical land of Arbor Creek. His official duties were now a distraction. Every spare hour was spent combing through the microfiches at the library, studying the original Silas Crawford patriarch from the 1830s. He discovered that the patriarch's sudden wealth, a massive acquisition of land and timber rights, had coincided precisely with the construction of the Crawfords' current house, built directly over the site of an even older, vanished structure. He needed a breakthrough, and that breakthrough had to come from the only surviving witness to the supernatural component, Lori Crawford. Lori was living with her maternal aunt, Martha, in a quiet suburb 2 hours outside of Arbor Creek. Wayne drove out on a cold, early spring morning, presenting his visit as a necessary follow-up to her trauma. Martha greeted him with wary skepticism. "Lori is doing better. She rarely speaks about that night or him," Martha said, gesturing vaguely towards the news reports of Arthur. "Please, detective, don't reopen old wounds. I need to understand what Silas saw," Wayne insisted gently. Not what her father did, but the things she mentioned, the shadow, the smell of the basement. Lori sat across from him in the sunlit living room, looking small and fragile. She was no longer wearing the wide-eyed costume of a child, but the guarded mask of a survivor. "The shadow wasn't a person, Detective Wayne," Lori said, her voice barely a whisper. "It was like the night had gotten solid. It stood behind Daddy at the lamppost. And when Silas was screaming, it was looking at his bucket. Did you ever see that shadow before Halloween?" Lori shook her head, then hesitated. "No, but Silas did. He kept saying the basement was where Daddy went to see the old man, and the day before, Silas was drawing." "Drawing what, Lori?" "The symbol. The 3 curved claws," she confirmed, validating Wayne's growing internal dossier of the strange. "He drew it everywhere. On his math homework, on the window with condensation. And he kept drawing a circle with a cross in the middle." Wayne felt a jolt of pure adrenaline. "Did he say what that symbol was?" Lori tilted her head, trying to recall. "He said it was the spot. The place where the dirt sings." Wayne thanked Lori, his head spinning. The spot. A circle with a cross. That was the classic ancient cartography mark for a well, a pit, or an underground reservoir. The mouth of the earth. The second phrase of the vow suddenly clicked into terrifying context. The mouth of the earth was a physical opening, possibly a forgotten well or a cistern on the Crawford property. But why did the vow specify the son had to open it? Wayne immediately returned to Arbor Creek and drove straight to the abandoned Crawford house. He ignored the no trespassing signs and headed for the backyard, which sloped steeply down towards a thicket of ancient oaks. He found the symbol immediately, not on a map, but on the land itself. Covered partly by moss and embedded in the ground near the oaks was a circular slab of granite, roughly 6 feet in diameter. It was clearly man-made, and etched deeply into its center was the symbol Lori had described, a circle with a cross dividing it into quarters. This was the cover to the mouth of the earth. Wayne felt the raw, cold stone beneath his boots. He understood now. Arthur had been trying to find a treasure, the prize the Taker of Vows was supposed to deliver. Arthur hadn't known he was following a ritual. He was simply following greed's map. The vow was complete. The Taker had received the price, the soul of Silas. The prize should have been revealed. Wayne tried to shift the heavy stone cover, but it was far too large and thick. He needed tools, and he needed a plan to explain this to the local authorities. As he stood there, wrestling with the immense slab, a quiet, amused voice spoke from the tree-line directly behind him. "You're wasting your strength, detective. Only the blood of the vow can grant you passage." Wayne spun around, his hand flying to his service pistol. Standing there, perfectly still, was a man. He was tall, dressed in impeccably tailored, old-fashioned black clothes that seemed to absorb the light, making him appear like a hole in the fabric of the woods. He wasn't the ragged shadow Lori had described, but he radiated the same cold, ancient malice. His face was unremarkable, except for his eyes. They were a deep, unnatural yellow, like old amber. Who are you? Wayne demanded, leveling the gun. You're trespassing on a crime scene. The man smiled, a slow, unsettling gesture that didn't involve his eyes. I am merely the facilitator, detective, the debt collector, and you are mistaken. The crime scene is not the house. It's the vow. He gestured towards the stone cover. Arthur Crawford was a pathetic fool, thinking he could simply kill the boy and collect the wealth. He didn't understand the contract. The price for the fortune, which is real, I assure you, is the soul of the sun, freely offered to open the mouth of the earth. Arthur simply poisoned his child to collect an insurance policy I facilitated. The vow requires the true sacrifice. Wayne felt sick. The true sacrifice? Silas is dead. Ah, but the vow states, the prize is only granted when the sun opens the mouth of the earth. Look closely at the stone, detective. Wayne slowly lowered his gun, his attention drawn back to the granite slab. He saw the symbol again, the circle and the cross. The Taker of Vows is precise, the man continued, stepping out of the shadows. Silas Crawford, the first son, paid the price. But the prize was never released because the first Silas was too scared to open the mouth. The vow passed down the lineage, waiting for a son who would complete the ritual. You convinced Arthur that Silas's insurance policy was the prize. I merely guided his greed, the facilitator corrected, his amber eyes glittering. Arthur's crime was a human distraction. The true debt remains. Wayne felt a horrifying realization creeping over him. The vow hadn't been completed. Arthur's murder was merely a tragic attempt to satisfy an ancient contract. Then who is supposed to open a mouth? Wayne asked, his voice raw. There is no other son. The facilitator smiled again, a triumphant, cold widening of the mouth. There is the next generation, detective, and the debt must be paid in full. He pointed towards the forest's edge, towards the direction of Laurie's new home. The taker only comes on Samhain, when the veil is thin. And it has waited for a very long time for the Crawfords to produce a daughter desperate enough to open that door for the sake of fortune. But the vow is absolute. It must be his son. The man's smile faded, replaced by cold seriousness. Tell me, Detective Wayne, do you think that the vow, after 150 years, would allow itself to be defeated by a simple lack of male heirs? Wayne stared at the man, a profound and horrifying premonition washing over him. The resolution was not simple. The vow had played a deeper, longer game than mere murder. What are you saying? The facilitator simply melted back into the deep shadows of the ancient oak trees, but his last words hung heavy in the air, a chilling prophecy. Arthur Crawford merely cleared the way for the real heir, detective. Look deeper into the past, and look closer at the survivor. The encounter with the man in black. The facilitator shattered Detective Wayne's remaining commitment to logic. He returned to the Arbor Creek Library, not seeking municipal records, but desperate to find an answer to the facilitator's chilling prophecy. The vow would not be defeated by a simple lack of male heirs. Wayne spent 3 days immersed in the archives, specifically focusing on the lineage of the original Silas Crawford, the patriarch from the 1830s, and the documentation surrounding the disappearance of his young son, also named Silas. The key proved to be the 1830s birth records. Most were illegible or vague, but in a small, separate folder marked Private Correspondence, Crawford Estate, Wayne found the truth hidden in a letter written by the family doctor of the time. The letter, dated 1835, detailed a complicated pregnancy and a subsequent secret. The patriarch, Silas Crawford I, was obsessed with maintaining the prestige of his name and ensuring his fortune would pass to a male heir, which was crucial for controlling the massive tracts of land he had recently acquired. Thanks to the vow, Wayne now realized. The letter stated, "The Lord has blessed the Crawfords with 2 children, but the second, born fragile and weak, was a daughter. To preserve the name and the land titles, the patriarch ordered the infant be registered as a boy. I pray God forgives us for this deception, but Alara is now known as Elian, and only her mother and I know the truth of her sex." Elian Crawford was the child who had disappeared on Samhain night in 1838, the son whose death coincided with the family's sudden, lasting wealth. Wayne stared at the parchment, feeling the cold precision of the Taker of Vows. The vow was absolute. The prize is only granted when the sun opens the mouth of the earth. The vow didn't care about biological reality. It cared about identity and designation. The first victim, the son Elian, was legally and publicly designated as a boy, thereby satisfying the identity required by the contract. Her soul was taken as the price, but the prize was never released because she never opened the mouth. The vow was waiting for the next designated son in the lineage. Wayne immediately pulled the birth records for Arthur Crawford's children. 1. Lori Crawford, daughter born 1966. Clear designation. 2. Silas Crawford, son born 1970. The victim, legally male. His death was the payment for the vow, not the completion of the ritual. The facilitator's words echoed in his mind. Look closer at the survivor. Wayne suddenly felt a profound, chilling dread that had nothing to do with Silas's death. He realized the question wasn't about who was born a son, but who was designated as one by the vow. He needed to check the family documents, not the public records. He drove to the courthouse and, using his badge, reviewed the sealed adoption and custody documents for the Crawford family. Arthur's parents, Wayne knew, had been secretive about their own lineage. He found it in the will of Arthur's grandfather, a man known for his extreme eccentricity and adherence to family superstitions. The document, dated 1960, detailed the succession of the property. It stipulated that if Arthur failed to produce a male heir within a certain time frame, the oldest surviving child, regardless of sex, must assume the name and legal identity of a designated son to maintain the integrity of the ancestral claim, and, unknowingly, the vow. The will went on to say that the grandfather had already initiated the necessary legal steps in 1965, a year before Lori was born, to create a legal, designated identity as a contingency. Wayne's hands shook as he read the name associated with this designated male identity, Silas Crawford Jr. Lori, the 12-year-old girl who had survived the poison, the quiet witness to the shadow, was legally designated as Silas Crawford Jr. in a secret family trust, meant to be activated if no male heir survived. The death of Silas Crawford, the boy, had tragically cleared the path for the activation of the designated son, Lori. The vow was not defeated. It had simply switched targets to the next available and designated son in the bloodline. Wayne looked at the date on the custody transfer papers. Lori's aunt, Martha, had formally taken custody of Lori as Lori Crawford on November 1st, 1978, the day after Silas's death. The next Samhain was fast approaching. The Taker of Vows was due to collect on the final part of the contract. Wayne realized that the purpose of Arthur's murder wasn't the insurance money. It was to eliminate the boy so that the vow could fall upon the designated heir, Lori/Silas Jr. He immediately called Lori's aunt, Martha, his voice tight with desperation. Martha, listen to me carefully. I need you to tell me if Lori has mentioned any recent gifts, anything unusual left on the doorstep or near the yard. Martha sounded annoyed. Detective Wayne, why are you disturbing us? Lori is fine. But yes, actually, it was strange. A package arrived yesterday. No return address. Just a small, cheap music box. Lori loves it. It plays an old, strange tune. Wayne's blood ran cold. The Taker of Vows didn't just wait. It facilitated. It lured. Martha, you must listen to me. Do not open any packages. Do not let Lori touch any new gifts. I'm coming there now. Do not leave the house. He hung up and raced out of the courthouse, knowing he was running out of time. He was no longer trying to solve a crime. He was trying to stop a century-old demonic contract from claiming its final, unexpected victim. Detective Wayne drove the 2 hours to Lori's new suburb in a state of frantic, focused terror. The gentle, manicured lawns and cheerful homes seemed an obscene contrast to the centuries-old black magic he was racing to intercept. The music box. The facilitator was not just waiting. He was actively preparing the new son, Lori, to complete the ritual. Wayne burst through the door of Aunt Martha's house, his demeanor frightening the already rattled woman. "Where's the music box, Martha? Where's Lori?" "Lori is in her room," Martha stammered, pointing down the hall. "She's been sitting with it for hours. It's calming, actually. I haven't heard her so quiet since." Wayne didn't wait. He moved down the hallway, drawing his pistol. He knew a gun wouldn't stop a demonic entity, but it was the only weapon he possessed. He found Lori sitting on her bed, motionless. The room was dark, the curtains drawn. On her lap, a small, dark wooden music box was open, playing a thin, reedy melody that was hauntingly simple, a tune that sounded less like music and more like an ancient, whispered language. Lori's eyes were open, but vacant. She was in a trance. "Lori!" Wayne shouted, rushing forward. As he reached the bed, the music box slammed shut with a sharp crack. Standing in the corner, emerging from the deepest shadow of the room, was the facilitator. He was no longer polite. His amber eyes blazed, and a palpable wave of cold, heavy air pressed against Wayne, forcing him to gasp. "You should not have come, detective," the facilitator said, his voice now layered and resonant, like gravel shifting in deep water. "The vow is meticulous. Arthur's interference merely hastened the final phase. Lori is ready to accept her destiny as Silas Crawford Jr." Wayne aimed his gun. "Get away from the girl." "Foolish man," the facilitator scoffed, taking a slow step forward. "This house is irrelevant. She has heard the call." The music box contained the old vows melody, the frequency that guides the designated heir to the mouth of the earth. "She knows where she must go." As he spoke, Lori slowly rose from the bed, still in a trance. She was pale, but her movements were smooth and precise, like a wind-up doll. She walked past Wayne and towards the door, her eyes fixed on some distant, unseen point. Wayne fired. The bullet ripped through the air where the facilitator had stood an instant before. The man had vanished, leaving only a lingering odor of ozone and dust. "Lori, stop!" Wayne ran to intercept her, grabbing her arm. Lori turned her head, and in her eyes, Wayne saw not the sister of Silas, but the vacant, cold stare of the designated heir. "I must go," Lori whispered, her voice strangely deep. "The debt is waiting. The fortune is in the ground." Her strength was unnatural. She violently pulled her arm free, knocking Wayne off balance. She then ran out of the room, heading straight for the front door, driven by a powerful, external compulsion. Wayne recovered quickly and followed, shouting to Martha to call the police. He knew the Arbor Creek PD would never arrive in time. Lori was already in his car, starting the engine. She had learned to drive on the farm. He watched in horror as Lori sped away, her small face visible for a moment in the rearview mirror, radiating a terrifying mix of blankness and determination. Wayne quickly jumped into his own cruiser. The chase was on. Lori, guided by the vow's hypnotic pull, was driving straight back to the Crawford house in Arbor Creek, to the backyard, and to the large granite slab covering the mouth of the earth. As he pursued her, Wayne pulled out his radio. He couldn't risk telling the truth to the police, but he had to get help. "Dispatch, this is Detective Wayne. Code 70. I have a pursuit of a vehicle driven by a minor. Target destination is the old Crawford property on Willow Street, Arbor Creek. I need a heavy response team and a tow truck, specifically a heavy lift crane, sent directly to the rear of the property, near the tree line. Repeat, a crane. Urgent." He was gambling everything. He couldn't open the mouth alone, but if Lori arrived, the vow might compel her to do it herself, fulfilling the prophecy. When Wayne arrived at the desolate Crawford house, Lori's car was abandoned near the tree line. She was already in the backyard, standing over the granite slab. She was no longer wearing the trance-like expression. Now, her face was contorted with an intense, unsettling effort. She was physically attempting to move the massive stone, her small hands clawing at the edges. "Lori, stop!" Wayne shouted, sprinting towards her. "I have to," she screamed, her voice cracking under the strain. "Silas, he didn't do it, but I can. I can get the money. I can make Daddy proud." The words were not her own. They were the desperate, echoing thoughts of Arthur Crawford, amplified by the vow. Wayne reached her and grabbed her by the shoulders, pulling her away from the slab. It's not money, Lori. It's a curse. It wants your soul. The moment he touched her, the air around them dropped 20 degrees. The familiar, oppressive presence of the Taker of Vows returned. The surrounding oak trees seemed to lean in, their branches twisting like skeletal arms. Lori fought him with a strength no 12-year-old possessed, her eyes flashing with a desperate, golden hue, the color of the facilitator's eyes. No, the vow is good. The vow promised wealth, she shrieked, breaking free. She threw herself at the slab, her small fingers finding purchase on a narrow, moss-covered seam. The sun opens the mouth of the earth, she screamed, and with a horrifying, supernatural surge of power, she moved the massive granite cover. The stone grated against the earth, revealing a dark, circular opening beneath. A profound, bone-chilling cold blast up from the pit, carrying with it the sickening smell of old, stagnant air, dust, and something indescribably rotten, like a billion dead memories. The mouth of the earth was open. A deafening, sucking sound erupted from the open pit, like the earth itself drawing a colossal, starved breath. The cold air intensified, turning the space around the mouth into a zone of absolute zero, where visibility shimmered and distorted. Lori, exhausted but ecstatic, stared into the void. The compulsion was so strong she felt no fear, only the promise of the wealth her father had desperately sought. Wayne, momentarily blinded by the sheer intensity of the supernatural presence, grabbed Lori and pulled her back, shielding her small body with his own. Lori, look at me. It's a trick. It's not money. But Lori fought him, her eyes wide with feverish greed. It is. I hear it. The gold. Daddy was right. Suddenly, the cold air solidified. The facilitator reappeared, standing on the edge of the pit. He was taller than before, and his black suit now seemed to be woven from pure shadow. His amber eyes fixed on Lori. The blood of the vow has paid the price, the facilitator intoned, his voice shaking the ground. The sun has opened the mouth of the earth. The prize is yours. Silas Crawford Jr. Come and take your fortune and deliver your soul. From the pit, a slow, agonizing clink, clatter, clink began to rise, the unmistakable sound of metal on stone. Lori, her face slack with longing, tried to push past Wayne. Let me go. It's mine. No. Wayne roared, tightening his grip. He aimed his gun at the facilitator, but hesitated. He knew this being wasn't flesh and blood. The facilitator sneered. Use your weapon, detective. It is useless against me. I am a taker of vows. I am a consequence of human greed. As the facilitator spoke, the contents of the pit began to spill out onto the grass. It wasn't a slow trickle, it was a deluge. Wayne stared in horrified disbelief. It was indeed a treasure, but not of gold. Poured forth from the pit were thousands of ancient, brittle papers. Ledgers, deeds, stock certificates, bank drafts, and insurance policies, all meticulously dated from the last 150 years. They represented the fortune the Crawford patriarchs had amassed through the vow, the original land deeds from the 1830s, the oil shares from the 1920s, and the bonds from the 1950s. And mixed amongst the physical wealth were thousands of small, blackened, dried human bones, scattered like macabre confetti. Lori was momentarily stunned, her greed giving way to revulsion. The fortune is real, the facilitator hissed, his voice full of dark satisfaction. It is the entire wealth of the Crawford line, legally documented and ready to be claimed. But every piece of paper is stained with the price, the sacrifice of the designated son. He then pointed a long, shadowy finger at the papers. This is the inheritance, and this, he pointed to the pile of small bones, is the tax. Every time a Crawford took wealth, a piece of the original Silas, Elian, was consumed by the vow. Arthur's $60,000 policy was merely the final documented piece of wealth from the taker. Now, the final prize, the entire fortune, is available, but the final greatest price is required. Your soul, Silas Crawford Jr., to forever be consumed by the earth. Lori began to weep, finally breaking free of the trance. realizing the true horror of her family's legacy. It wasn't for the money, Wayne suddenly understood, looking at the facilitator. You don't care about the gold. You care about the vow. The vow is the taker, detective, the being replied, his form undulating. And the vow demands compliance. For 150 years, the Crawfords have broken the ritual, allowing their greed to substitute for the final act. But Arthur's murder of the boy, Silas, made the vow fall upon the true, designated heir. The debt will be settled today. The facilitator stretched his shadowy arms toward Lori, intending to claim her. Wayne knew he couldn't shoot him. He had to break the vow itself. He remembered the brittle parchment he had found in the basement. The vow shall pass to the next generation of blood until the price is paid in full. He needed to destroy the core of the contract. As the facilitator lunged, Wayne quickly pulled the evidence jar from his coat pocket, the jar containing the black earth, the lock of hair, and the original ancient parchment. The contract is with the earth. Wayne yelled, running towards the open pit. The facilitator turned, his amber eyes wide with panic for the first time. No, that is the seed of the contract. You cannot interfere with the vow. The facilitator launched himself at Wayne, a whirlwind of malice and cold. They collided right on the edge of the pit. Wayne felt the terrible, draining cold of the entity, a chill that threatened to stop his heart. But Wayne held firm. With a final, desperate surge of human adrenaline, he hurled the glass jar containing the seed of the contract, the black earth and the ancient parchment, directly into the gaping, dark mouth of the earth. The moment the jar shattered on the unseen bottom of the pit, the world reacted violently. A massive, silent shockwave erupted. The papers and bones that lay scattered on the ground instantly turned to black dust and ash. The facilitator's form, which had been so solid and terrifying, began to unravel, tearing at the edges like old silk. You have broken the bond, the taker's voice roared, a sound of pure agony and defeated ancient power. You have destroyed the vow. The price is lost. The shadow entity was pulled backward, screaming soundlessly, dissolving into the blackness of the pit. The massive granite slab, the cover of the mouth of the earth, suddenly heaved and slammed shut with a final, echoing boom, sealing the dark pit forever. Silence descended, heavy and absolute, broken only by the hysterical sobs of Lori. Wayne, lying on the ground, gasping for air, looked up. The sky was just beginning to lighten with the first cold rays of the dawn, November 1st. The vow was settled. The taker was gone. The local police response, alerted by Wayne's urgent call for a crane, arrived 20 minutes later to find Detective Elias Wayne sitting on the ground next to a traumatized 12-year-old girl, staring at a massive, freshly sealed granite slab in the dirt. There was no sign of a mysterious man in black, no scattered bones, and no ancient papers. Only ash and the residual stench of ozone and rot. Wayne, knowing he could never articulate the truth to his colleagues, simply stated that Lori had suffered a severe panic attack, hallucinated, and attempted to dig up the rumored family treasure site, believing it contained the insurance money. He claimed he had used the heavy object, a fallen section of chimney, to seal the depression for safety until a proper excavation could be done. The official report noted the extreme trauma of the child and dismissed the event as a hysterical reaction to the lingering stress of her father's recent conviction. The necessity for the crane was baffling, but Wayne was given the benefit of the doubt. The case of the Taker of Vows was buried forever. 1 year later, November 1st, 1979, Arthur Crawford was scheduled for execution, but due to lengthy appeals, he remained on death row. He was a broken man, abandoned by everyone, including his former creditors. Lori Crawford, now 13, was flourishing. She had moved with Aunt Martha far from Arbor Creek and was undergoing therapy. She remembered the whole ordeal, her father's greed, Silas's death, the terrifying shadow, and the final confrontation at the pit. She understood that her father's death had been an attempt to save himself, not the family, and that she was nearly consumed by the same generational curse. Detective Wayne visited her periodically. He never mentioned the taker, the vow, or Silas Crawford Jr. he focused on her healing. Lori was a survivor, but the price of breaking the vow had been steep. Wayne was sitting in his lonely apartment in Arbor Creek, reviewing the final financial files related to Arthur Crawford's estate. Lori was the sole surviving heir. The $60,000 insurance payout from Silas's death had been tied up in legal disputes, but it was finally released. The final paperwork arrived that evening. Wayne was expecting the insurance money to be disbursed to Lori's trust fund, but the document contained a shock that made him spill his coffee. The payout was not $60,000. It was zero. The bank statement noted that shortly after the vow was broken, the morning of November 1st, 1978, every single asset Arthur Crawford had ever possessed, legally traceable to him, had been seized and liquidated by an anonymous claimant citing unsettled ancestral debt against the Crawford estate. The Taker of Vows was gone, but the debt was still collected. Wayne realized the horrifying truth. The fortune the Taker had offered, the papers, the deeds, the bonds, had all disintegrated into dust when the vow was broken. But the modern, liquid asset, the $60,000 insurance policy, was the last piece of the vow's prize that was still tied to the Crawford name and readily available. When the contract was destroyed, the Taker, in its final, agonizing act, hadn't just vanished. It had claimed the final piece of the debt on its way out, ensuring the Crawfords received absolutely nothing. Arthur had murdered his son for $60,000, and the curse had ensured he got exactly zero, not just for his crime, but as a final, cruel twist to the family's fate. Wayne leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The Crawfords were finally free, but at the cost of his son's life and the complete obliteration of their family wealth. He picked up the phone and called Lori's aunt, Martha. "Martha, about the inheritance. There's been a problem. It seems the Crawford estate was completely wiped out by an old claim." Martha sighed, sounding tired but strangely relieved. "That's fine, Detective. Lori doesn't need the money. It was never hers to begin with." She paused. "But Detective, there's one thing." "Yes." Yesterday, November 1st, a year after that night, Lori found something on her front porch. It was just a small box. Inside was a single old, dusty Pixie Sticks candy. No claw marks. No symbols. Just an empty wrapper, folded perfectly. Wayne felt the coldness creep up his spine one last time. "Did she touch it?" "No," Marta whispered. "She just looked at it. And then she threw it away. She said, 'The old debt is settled. I'm not a son, and I don't need the vow's prize.'" Wayne hung up the phone. The Taker was defeated, the vow was broken, and the fortune was gone. But the final, most terrifying legacy was not the curse, but the knowledge of greed. The empty wrapper was a final message. The temptation remains. Elias Wayne, the skeptical detective, extinguished the lamp, leaving the dark of his apartment to the silence of Arbor Creek. He was no longer afraid of the shadows, but of the things humans would do to fulfill an obsession. The vow was broken, but the memory of Silas's scream, Samhain, would echo through his life forever. The curse was over, but the story of the Crawford family's greed would never truly end.